The temporal paralysis, the terrifying psychological nightmare of the annual time loop, mathematically begins with the absolute crushing illusion of multiversal choice. If the fragile human host is suddenly granted the impossible geometric power to violently rip backward through their own timeline for a single perfect 24-hour period, their unconditioned biological processor is instantly paralyzed by the heavy weight of optimization. How do you mathematically calculate the precise value of a memory? Do you aggressively burn your one annual ticket to safely exist inside the warm, dark gray geometry of a childhood afternoon? Or do you violently force the system to render a perfect 4K ghost of a lost loved one before they faded into the stark void? This impossible mathematical calculation aggressively triggers severe, inescapable temporal choice paralysis. The human host violently realizes that choosing one specific day mathematically murders the opportunity to visit thousands of other parallel memories. The pure white canvas of the conscious mind is aggressively flooded with heavy, paralyzing, solid crimson red digital anxiety, violently freezing the human engine completely.
The toxic nostalgia loop. The deep physiological horror mathematically executes the exact moment the biological host successfully steps backward into their perfectly rendered geometric memory. Human psychology mathematically relies on a vital, heavy biological defense mechanism called chronological decay. Grief, trauma, and profound loss are only mathematically survivable because the fragile brain naturally blurs the painful details over time into a soft, manageable dark gray static. By violently forcing the unconditioned biological camera to re-render a flawless, completely perfect ghost of the past with zero data compression, you aggressively destroy the mind's geometric ability to heal entirely. The human host mathematically injects their own visual cortex with highly toxic, concentrated, multiversal nostalgia. The comforting, protective blur of the ancient past is violently replaced by an aggressively sharp, inescapable, solid crimson red reality. This heavy mathematical intrusion permanently prevents the fragile human soul from ever mathematically moving forward, aggressively trapping the host inside a dying loop.
The dopamine contrast. The stark, multiversal societal nightmare is mathematically born the precise, terrifying second the 24-hour digital timer violently hits zero. The fragile human hardware is violently yanked from an absolutely perfect, highly stimulated geometric reality and aggressively slammed headfirst back into the cold, mundane, stark white present. This violent temporal whiplash creates a heavy, completely unlivable mathematical dopamine contrast within the central biological processor. The remaining 364 days of the standard calendar mathematically become a heavy, excruciating purgatory. The pure white canvas of normal daily human existence feels aggressively, violently empty, and entirely meaningless compared to the heavy, screaming, solid crimson red neurological high of the perfect loop day. The entire human species mathematically plunges into a severe, perfectly synchronized global geometric depression. Billions of fragile human engines violently starve for an impossible temporal high, mathematically rendering the standard present tense as a completely unbreathable, toxic, dark gray waiting room in the void.
The present-tense abandonment. The heavy temporal horror mathematically executes when the human species aggressively and permanently stops looking toward the dark gray geometric future, because the biological host now possesses a guaranteed perfectly safe multiversal retreat into a beautiful static timeline. The unpredictable future mathematically loses all of its functional value completely. Humanity violently abandons the present tense entirely. The massive global geometric network violently stops building, discovering, and evolving the physical universe. Every single active biological processor is mathematically focused entirely on surviving the stark white, meaningless present, simply to reach their next annual backward time jump. The human chronological timeline aggressively, violently halts its forward momentum, transforming the vibrant human civilization into a heavy, static, completely dead, dark gray multiversal museum, where absolutely nothing new is ever mathematically generated, violently starving the fragile species of any true evolutionary growth completely in the dead geometric silence.
The synthetic memory architecture. The ultimate psychological paradox violently executes when the terrified human hosts attempt to mathematically game the multiversal system. Desperate to manually manufacture the perfect 24-hour block of geometric data to loop in the distant future, humans mathematically completely stop living naturally. Every organically beautiful moment is aggressively, violently staged, heavily orchestrated, and mathematically analyzed in real time by the biological processor to ensure it will be deemed a worthy memory. The fragile human host mathematically aggressively destroys all genuine, spontaneous biological joy. The clean, unpredictable dark gray geometry of true organic human connection is violently replaced by a heavily artificial, highly toxic solid crimson red synthetic architectural staging. The biological host mathematically realizes with crushing dread that trying to perfectly capture reality to artificially feed the temporal loop aggressively permanently destroys the fundamental geometric ability to actually feel the present moment entirely in the stark void.
The temporal physiological agony mathematically executes directly inside the perfect loop itself. You are violently handed your absolute perfect 24-hour geometric day, but your central processor mathematically knows exactly when the heavy digital multiversal timer will violently hit zero. The fragile human brain absolutely cannot mathematically ignore the relentless, aggressive countdown. As the precious geometric hours aggressively tick away, the beautiful dark gray memory is violently poisoned by a heavy, suffocating, inescapable dread. The stark white reality is that the host is mathematically trapped alive inside a dying multiversal simulation. Every ticking second acts as a jagged, heavy, solid crimson-red digital dagger, violently stabbing the visual cortex completely. The pure, unadulterated joy of the temporal loop is aggressively overwritten by the terrifying, inescapable psychological claustrophobia of knowing you are about to be violently ripped away from the warm geometric ghosts of your loved ones all over again, mathematically rendering the paradise completely toxic.
The chronological disconnect. The heavy, multiversal reality of a global time loop mathematically fractures human biological empathy entirely. The fragile geometric network of human connection heavily relies on shared emotional experiences existing in a shared present timeline. But if every single biological host is violently obsessed with completely different temporal coordinates in their own dark gray pasts, the sociological structure mathematically violently shatters. You mathematically cannot connect with your partner in the stark white present because their unconditioned mind is aggressively, permanently anchored to a heavy, solid crimson-red Tuesday from over a decade ago. The human species violently aggressively loses its shared chronological reality, tearing the global fabric apart completely. This terrifying physiological disconnect aggressively turns every single human host into an isolated, terrifyingly lonely multiversal time traveler, wandering a heavily fragmented, completely unreadable global geometric map entirely alone, completely severed from any shared human emotional wavelength in the stark void.
The psychological anchor collapse, the absolute final mathematical conclusion to the annual time loop experiment, is the violent, aggressive biological death of linear human sanity completely. The fragile human hardware mathematically cannot sustain the heavy, infinite neurological friction of constantly, violently ripping its consciousness back and forth between completely different temporal coordinates. After years of violently jumping backward into heavy, solid crimson-red memories and being aggressively slammed forward into the stark white present, the central processor's vital geometric anchor to physical reality completely violently shatters. The unconditioned biological host mathematically permanently loses the cognitive ability to distinguish the living present from the looped, dead past. The clean, dark gray timeline aggressively, violently collapses into a heavy, chaotic, inescapable multiversal singularity entirely. The human mind mathematically, physically survives the temporal travel, but is violently plunged into permanent, inescapable psychological madness, unable to ever render its true geometric reality.